What's going on, everyone? Here at the Connectin Podcast, we converse about the latest in sports and entertainment. And our special guest today, he comes from the sport of professional boxing. He is the on-air host of Inside Boxing Live on Pluto TV. Folks, he's the one and only Dan Canobbio. Dan, what's going on, man?
Thank you for having me. Doing well. Got a busy week coming up with this Spence Ugas fight. We're going to touch on that. Busy month. This past weekend was crazy with Ryan Garcia, Sebastian Fundora, Triple G, Murata fighting at 8 a.m. In 2 weeks from now, we're going to have Tyson Fury in the ring with Dillian White in front of 95,000 fans at Wembley. And then the following week, you got one of the biggest women's fights of all time, Amanda Serrano versus Katie Taylor, and then, of course, Oscar Valdez versus Core Stevenson. So in my world, the boxing world, this is one of the craziest months ever, but it's a great thing because it gives us a lot to talk about.
Yeah. But first and foremost, Dan, if you could elaborate to our fellow viewers on your concurrent broadcast work within the sports industry.
Yeah, so I host my podcast, Inside Boxing Live. Do it every week. Been doing it since 2017. I enjoy it. It's a great sport to cover because there's just so much going on. There's no real season, there's no off season in boxing, and there's a lot of chatter. So that's great for if you're in the business of talking about a sport where you can discuss upcoming fights, you can discuss the negotiations, you can discuss the business side, you can discuss the actual fights that take place in the ring. You can sit there and debate about the decisions of the sport. You can talk about fights from years past. So there's always something to talk about in the boxing world. Like I just illustrated in the open, like there's so many big fights on the upcoming schedule, not just April, but May is loaded, June, and now July, now with Usyk coming back to face Anthony Joshua. So I enjoy doing the show I started in 2017, but before that I was like more behind the scenes where I was working at CBS Sports as a researcher. I worked at Bleacher Report City as a production assistant, producer on college football. I worked at MLB Network as a researcher, intern, hosted radio. So I've done a little bit of everything. And I always say that it helped me to where I am today because I learned all the different facets of media, whether it's print. I did write in college at West Virginia, whether it's radio, whether it's television, whether it's digital. I've done pretty much every job you can do in sports media, but I always wanted to be on camera. So that's the last step for me. And I really am enjoying it and have some big things to announce this upcoming week, a new home for my show and a new home for me. So a lot going on.
Awesome. What would you say is your first recollection that made you pursue a career in sports broadcasting?
So I grew up in the world of boxing. My father created CompuBox in 1985. It's the punch counting system in boxing and still used today. We're very busy, do over 100 shows a year. So my earliest recollections, 3 years old, Mike Tyson, meeting him and him holding me, and after his loss to Buster Douglas, and just being around the sport of boxing at a very young age, being around television, being around production, being around some of the best broadcasters in the world, Jim Lampley, Larry Merchant, Max Kellerman, on the HBO side of things, and at ESPN with, Al Bernstein, and he was still at ESPN. He's now at Showtime, and Barry Tompkins, who's one of the best to ever do it. So I have a lot of recollections. I have a lot of just being around the sport behind the scenes, and then always knew I wanted to work in sports because I believe it doesn't even, sometimes, obviously, yes, it does feel like a real job, but I mean, there are times where you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm getting paid for this.
Love it. But rolling with the punches, Dan, it's fight week. We got Errol Spence Jr. and your Dennis Ugas for the Unified Welterweight Championship of the World taking place this Saturday on Showtime pay-per-view. Dan, what can we expect from this welterweight bout?
It's a 3-belt unification. One step closer to undisputed. Errol Spence is looking for that 3rd belt. Standing in his way is your Dennis Ugas, and Ugas coming off of one of the biggest wins of his career, definitely the biggest win of his career, and one of the biggest wins of 2021 when he retired Manny Pacquiao. That was a big upset, even though Pacquiao was 42 years old and he was coming off of a really long layoff. Beating Manny Pacquiao means something. He hadn't lost since the Mayweather fight in 2015. And you had Ugas come in there on 10 days notice, because this was supposed to be Spence versus Pacquiao last summer. Spence suffered an eye injury, which I'll touch on in a second. But yeah, it's a huge fight in the welterweight division. 3 belts on the line, one step closer to undisputed, which the 4th belt is owned by Terrence Crawford, who's pound for pound 1 or number 2 in all of boxing. This is a really big fight. Errol Spence has been snake bitten. Some of his own doing, obviously driving drunk and flipping his car and getting into a nasty car accident in 2019 that took him almost a year to recover from, when he got back into the ring against Danny Garcia in December of 2020. I thought he looked great in that fight against Danny Garcia, getting an easy win. But then he suffers an eye injury in a retinal tear, which would end a lot of careers. And he came back even quicker. And this time, he's not taking on a soft touch. He's taking on a champ in Ugas. So that's on the Spence side of things. Ugas, a guy that had lost back-to-back fights in 2014, was ready to quit the sport, stopped fighting for 2 years. And it was actually Yankees pitcher Aroldis Chapman, also from Cuba, that kind of like financed his comeback, helped him mentally and physically, and got him back into the ring. And I think he's won, obviously he lost to Sean Porter, but he's reeled off 9 of 10 wins since those back-to-back losses. He's peaking, even though he's 36 years old. It's a great fight. I mean, it's just 2 guys that are both southpaws who, fight similar styles. I think it's really close. Vegas has it close. 3 belts on the line. Winner is probably going to get Terrence Crawford at Jerry World. It's going to be a huge crowd. So, I mean, this is everything you want.
Obviously, everything's bigger in Texas. But moving on, another highly anticipated fight on the horizon. We got the current undisputed super middleweight champion, Canelo Alvarez, taking on Dimitri Bivol for the WBA light heavyweight title, taking place May 7th, live on the Zone pay-per-view. Dan, how do you see this fight playing out?
Oh, man, this is a tough fight for Canelo. It's a tough fight for Bivol, too, obviously. But I think this is going to be Canelo's toughest fight since the 2 fights with Triple G back in 2017 and 2018, mostly because Canelo is going up against a legit 175-pounder. He has fought before at 175, Canelo, but that was against a fading, aging, not committed Sergey Kovalev. And, it took him 11 rounds to take out Kovalev. I thought Kovalev arguably could have been winning that fight. But this is a guy that's in his prime in Bivol, a guy that is strong. He can move, he can box, he can jab. He's got really good defense. He's very accurate, and he's big. And there's no rehydration clause in this fight. So Bivol can come in at, close to 200 pounds if he really want to. Which makes this fight even more interesting too. Canelo is the best boxer in the game right now. He is the face of the sport. He just cleared out the 168-pound division in 12 months, and now in his next fight after unifying and at 168 is to jump up to 175 and take on a guy that is undefeated in Dimitri Bivol, a legit test for Canelo. But I think Canelo will break him down. I think he's going to have some really, really tough time early on figuring out Bivol's movement, figuring out the jab. But I ultimately think Canelo feasts on these taller opponents. He goes to the body like no other. He's faced, I think now this is his 6th fighter that is 6 foot or taller. Canelo's 5'8", 5'9", and he just destroys them because those body shots are legit, right in his wheelhouse to land. And I think he'll do that to Bivol, break him down to the body. And I don't think he's going to stop him, but I do think it's going to go to the scorecards. It'll be a close fight, but I think a clear win for Canelo Alvarez. And then he can unify at 175 if he gets the winner of Beterbiev and Joe Smith, which should be announced any moment. That's a huge fight. Cinco de Mayo weekend, Canelo's back. He hasn't fought on Cinco de Mayo weekend in a few years now. He's back on his schedule of every May and September. He wants to be fighting. And then he's also rumored teased throwing in a December fight. So, I mean, the guy's he's the guy in boxing right now, and he's doing things that, I never thought were possible. And he's making it look easy.
And speaking of Canelo, assuming he gets past Bivol and looking at Triple G's performance over Murata, do you see a Canelo Golovkin trilogy happening this fall?
Yeah, I mean, that's the rumor, and that's what Matchroom signed Canelo to do. They gave him a boatload of money, close to 90 or 85 to 90 million for 2 fights. One of them is going to be this Bivol fight, and the second was supposed to be the third fight with Golovkin. And we just saw Golovkin this past weekend. Fight road to Murata, 8 a.m. Eastern from Japan, and that was a brutal fight. I mean, that was like Rock'em Sock'em Robots. I thought Golovkin looked good, considering he's 40 years old, considering he hadn't fought in like 15 months. Still boiling down to 160 pounds as a 40-year-old is not easy. It took some lumps early. He's a slow starter. Golovkin always has been. Gets stronger as the fight goes on. Was still able to throw close to 70 punches around. Outlanded Murata down the stretch. Hurt him. So precise with the power. Still has that piston-like jab. I still think he gives Canelo a competitive fight. I know I tweeted that, and I got a lot of people were like, "What are you talking about? There's no way Canelo's going to destroy him." Golovkin has never been down in a round, let alone knocked out. So we need to pump the brakes. Yeah, he's got a hell of a chin. I mean, but to the body. I mean, the body is susceptible for Golovkin. We saw that against Derevyanchenko for the first time, where we saw Golovkin take a step back. We never seen Golovkin take a step back. He did in that Derevyanchenko fight, and he did a lot against Murata in those early rounds. The body punches were visibly hurting Golovkin, and like I just said earlier, Canelo is the best body puncher in boxing. I don't think he's going to win, Golovkin, but I think he could make the fight fun because he is willing to take punches. No one else is willing to stand and trade with Canelo, only Triple G in those 2 fights. I still think Triple G is crazy enough to stand and trade with Canelo, and he could still hit hard. Power doesn't go. That's the last thing to go on a fighter is power. And I still think Golovkin has the power, as we saw with Murata. Has the punch volume, has the jab. Defense is just eroded on the Golovkin, and that will probably be the demise in that third fight. I still want to see it. Maybe there are probably 2 or 3 other fights I'd rather see Canelo win. I'd rather see him fight the Beterbiev Smith winner. But still rather see him fight Benavidez or Charlo. But those aren't on the table. A third fight with Golovkin is on the table because it makes money commercially. DAZN wanted it for the last 3 years. That's the reason they signed both these guys, was to make this trilogy. It's about 3 years too late, but we also said the same thing about Fury and Wilder, right? I mean, no one wanted to see that third fight between Fury and Wilder. It ended up being the best of all 3. So this could be another one of these wars between Canelo and Triple G, or maybe it could be the final fight in the illustrious career of Golovkin. Either way, we're all going to watch. And if you say you're not going to watch, you're just kidding yourself.
Absolutely. We shall see. But Dan, let's play matchmaker. As fight fans, we love to see the big fights marinate. We love to fantasize dream matchups. So what would you say would be your top 3 dream matchups that you want to see take place this year?
Oh, this year? I want to see, if you told me this like last week, I would have said I want to see Ryan Garcia versus Tank Davis as one of my dream matches. But I thought Ryan Garcia took a little bit of a step back. Didn't look great, but I think he'll get to where he wants to be. He has a new trainer, and he's still young, and he has been out of the ring for a while. But Gervonta Davis, Ryan Garcia is one fight I want to see this year. Another fight I want to see this year is Tyson Fury versus the winner of the Usyk Joshua fight. I think Fury's going to beat Dillian White. I'm not exactly 100% sure that Usyk beats Joshua again. I'm quite certain, but that one I think has a little more competitive. So I want to see the undisputed heavyweight championship be figured out, and of course I want to see undisputed at 147. I want to see Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford once and for all now, while they're still somewhat in their prime. Spence is 32 now. He is not the same fighter that he was 3 years ago. He's throwing less punches. His connect rate is down. But Crawford seems like he is still at the top of his game, and he's 35. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, these 2 guys were at once the next thing in the welterweight division, and now they're getting called out by Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz. It's crazy how that comes full circle. But I think this year, if that fight gets made, it's still competitive, still makes a ton of money. So those are the 3 fights: Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis, Tyson Fury versus either Joshua or Usyk, and Spence versus Crawford.
Love it. But shifting gears, Dan, you've been traveling across the world to interview prominent fighters in the realm of combat sports, as well as reporting a number of fights throughout your career in broadcasting. So with that being said, what is your favorite moment in your broadcasting career so far?
Oh, wow. That's crazy. Probably interviewing Mike Tyson. I interviewed him last November 2020. It was the week leading up to his fight with Roy Jones, the exhibition fight. And I've been wanting to interview him forever, ever since I met him when I was 3 years old. And that was always like the interview for me. It was always like, oh, have you ever interviewed Mike Tyson? And I was like, he's hard to get. But all it took was him to come back after 20 years, get back in the ring and do some fight week media. So that was a big moment for me. Had a lot of, being on Fox Sports, national TV was a huge thing for me and was just really cool, growing up watching Fox Sports, the World Series or Super Bowl. And once they got into boxing, was pretty cool. And then that was my first real breakthrough in media, was getting on Fox, doing these little segments for PBC. And yeah, man, I would say those are two of my big ones, and just everything in between too. Just getting to talk about boxing week in, week out on my show, getting to interview some of these big names, Dame Lillard, Sugar Ray Leonard, Michael Buffer. He might not belong in the same group with Jake Paul, funny guy. Fights that, people like that just shows the range of boxing. It brings a lot of different people together. So I enjoy that. And I also enjoy that it's just like a silly sport sometimes. A lot of characters. There's a lot of funny stories. There's a lot of, strange things that happen. And I feel like, I do a decent job of illustrating the wild, wild west, which is boxing.
Awesome. But to close the show, Dan, what would you say is the kind of advice or what would you give to aspiring sports journalists heading into the industry?
I would say just be consistent, be yourself, stick with it. Even when if you feel like no one's listening, or you feel like, oh man, why am I still doing this? But you have to start somewhere and you have to be consistent. That's the one thing I always tell everyone. If you do a podcast, put it out every single week, even if you don't feel like doing it, or even if you don't think there's any content that week. That's, to me, is the most rewarding shows, when there's not much going on and you have to be creative and you have to come up with something. But, just give it everything you have. It's just, what I do is I prepare a lot, but I also am just be myself, and I'm just generally a positive guy and just generally passionate about the sport that I cover. And I think that will shine through, and that the fans and your listeners will hear it.
Love it. Well, folks, that's all for today's episode. Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to hop on the podcast and sharing your story and expertise in the fight game. Thank you for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time.